Thank you, Irene. Now you know why I asked him to do that. I had to have somebody else come up with some of the font jokes, so I'm not the only one telling them all day. So, just for a moment before I start, I wanted to tell you a couple things about this talk in particular. Being here on this stage is pretty special to me because this company, FITC, Sean, Jackie, Alfred, all the people involved are people that have been welcoming me back here for a number of years, and it's just a great organization. I've met a ton of great friends. And 2 years ago, I came here with a not more than 48-hour-old build of Safari to show a brand new type technology called variable fonts. And this was, I think, outside of the conference where it was introduced, perhaps the first place that we actually got to see it running in a browser. And that was really kind of amazing to me, because as somebody who loves type and somebody who's been involved in design for many, many years, that's a really huge step forward in what type can do. I hope that doesn't keep doing what it's doing.
Losing video to your computer there, it looks like. Yeah. Check your dongle.
How many times have we all heard that? It was not actually quite plugged in, so hopefully that will be better. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to tell you is that, oh, this is going to make me so sad. I don't quite know what to do here. I can try another one. Let's see if we start moving, if it actually gets a little better. 2 years later, I'm still talking about variable fonts. I'm actually talking about them a lot more. But what I'm showing you here for the very first time is actually a presentation that's actually built entirely in HTML and CSS with variable fonts. So this whole thing is actually be running in Firefox. Big plug to them. They've been doing an incredible job in building new tooling and support. And I think we're going to try a different one of these little plugs, because it would really be sad if I spent this time on it and you actually have to pantomime the whole thing.
Oh, you have this. This is what you were using, or oh, you had that one?
Yeah, this one's mine. Okay, fingers crossed. That will do the trick. Okay, I wanted to tell you that this is running in the browser, for those of you that didn't actually notice the browser frame there, because I wanted to show that this stuff is real. It's not just interesting screen captures. It's not just slides. It's real websites that can run it. It's real usage. It's one really big company in particular that I'm going to show you. But all of this is done using native CSS, a tiny little bit of JavaScript, using a bunch of techniques that I've learned from a bunch of other people that have been on the stage here, people like Val Head, Rachel Neighbors, Leah Veru, that taught me a huge amount about animation and that sort of thing too. So let's get started a little bit. I'll distract you for a moment with Tristan and Tilly, because they will be a bit of a recurring theme. And so just to set the stage a little bit about what this talk is going to be about is not just about a new technology, but also about how this helps us look backwards to bring a little bit more design into what we're doing with this new technology. Thinking about what Ethan was talking about earlier and what Berman was talking about in prototyping things, we don't want to throw away things that came before. We don't want to get rid of centuries of knowledge about typography and how written communication actually works. So I'm going to come back to these two every so often because they actually help kind of illustrate that point. But it's also a little bit of a rest. There's a lot of stuff to take in. So let's start going backwards. So this manuscript was written about 600 or 700 years ago. And one of the things that I loved about this is that it very physically and visually conveys the importance of the message that it is trying to convey. This is about the Word of God being conveyed by these monks. So whatever your own personal belief system is, it's kind of irrelevant. It's not one that particularly resonates with me, but I can appreciate the effort and the significance of the artifact itself. And that's what I thought was really important. So it is about the type and how it is presented that influences your mood and the significance that you attach to the thing that you're looking at. Coming forward, you can see this further refinement of systems. This is a drawing from a monotype matrix, which is a letter form drawing from hot metal type. This was drawn about 80 or 90 years ago. And you can see all of this information encoding the beauty of that letter form and its meaning all into this one layered piece of information display, which was then used to craft the type that was being molded and used to print the page. I really thought that was kind of fascinating. We're talking about structured meaning and intent in the physical manifestation of the type as it's being used to convey that information. And so that comes forward even further, looking at something like the Elements of Typographic Style. Again, it's a whole book dedicated to informing people about the structure and relationship of meaning and composing text so that it can most easily be read. And if you can't read the text, then you're not going to get anything from it. So there's an intimate connection between content and consumer, and the physical aspect of that is the type itself. So now Elements of Typographic Style first came out in the 90s. I'm going back to the 30s to a treatise written by Beatrice Ward, who's a tremendously talented critic and creative director and editor, actually the first editor of Monotype's Reporter magazine, which was a really influential publication. And in this essay, she wrote about this notion of a crystal goblet, that there could be this perfect form of typography that would most beautifully render this content without color, without distortion. So meaning that the typography is accurately presenting the content but not influencing its meaning. And I think the problem with a premise like that is that the type that you choose influences how people receive that message. So even making a choice to be neutral is a choice. And the truth is, the type is never neutral. It always says something. Everybody's got a font joke that they've heard about something, or they walk in the mall and they see the papyrus store and they shudder. Whatever. It doesn't matter what it is, it's always something. And so I want to keep that in mind as we start thinking about how are we thinking about typography, how are we implementing it, how are we ensuring that it adds to the experience in an application and on the web in ways that it's actually going beyond what we've been able to do in print. There's actually some things that I'm going to show you today that really are not possible in other platforms. So think about this, and think about what it doesn't say. It's the words, but it's kind of like, meh. It's just there. But a type-obsessed hipster might say it like this. And that has a little bit more flair, but it's still not quite the same as this. Something actually in the human hand. So whether or not that's a typeface or not, I mean, I think there are plenty of script typefaces that actually are based on human handwriting. Carolyn Porter wrote a whole book called Marcel's Letters, devoted to analyzing those letters and working on a font that is actually based in the handwriting of the gentleman that wrote these letters that she found in this old trunk. It's really quite remarkable, and it's absolutely tied to the physical representation. So it led me to this notion. That's that connection. Type is how we hear what we read. So every time you look at something in print, you're going to be influenced by a couple of things. How is it actually typeset? What is the typeface that's used? How well is it put down? And do you know the author? And I always find that kind of interesting because that's also another one of those things that colors how you take in a piece of information. There's very little I can read about semantic structural HTML and not hear it in Jeremy Keith's voice. And I kind of like that, but still, it's an influence. It's a shaper of how we take in that meaning. And in print, we've known this for a long time, from that manuscript all the way up to this book on W.A. Dwiggins, who is a Massachusetts-based designer. And this book was dedicated to his work and his typefaces. So it's got all these lovely touches and ligatures and that initial capital A there that really helps embody the character and quirkiness of Dwiggins as a designer, and also the time in which he worked. And we can actually do an awful lot of that on the web. I've been talking about this for a long time, actually, at these conferences and others. It's not just that we can use web fonts, but we can actually use really nice web fonts in various different ways, and we can create initial capitals and capitalized first lines and get ligatures and all of these touches that we can get based on available characteristics in open type fonts. So things that you can get from Typekit, things you can get from Google Fonts, and it's all accessible via CSS. So with some care, we can actually achieve relative parity in our typesetting on the web, albeit with some important caveats, but we're reaching this sort of plateau where we can only speak so loudly because of other considerations like performance. So we don't use all of the same font files that we might want to use. We actually sort of bring down the vocabulary because of the time it takes for those things to load. But we also have this inherent tension where the next day somebody wants to change some of that content. So they rewrote the header. So that changes the typesetting. It's now 2 lines instead of 3. And then engineering came and said they needed to load another JavaScript tracking file, and so we have to lose the web fonts altogether. And that's it. So this notion that we can actually natively have as wide a vocabulary as we want gets tossed out the window in the face of better performance. So wanting to make sure that the content shows up has really made sure that we don't actually get to be as expressive as we want, so we have 2 weights of a typeface. And what a lot of people don't realize is in a typical print publication or layout, there might be 15 different weights that are used. There's an incredible amount of modulation that you can get when you have access to the full spectrum of a typeface. And it really does allow you to speak much more eloquently in a much more finely tuned manner, especially when you're thinking about how this will work across devices. So this is where I trash talk design systems. I just figured I should come clean about that. It's not that I don't like them, it's in how we use them and how we think about them that I think we fall into a trap. Because if you think back to that notion of the crystal goblet about this one perfect form of typography that can convey any content, text, without shaping it or coloring it, well, I think there are some inherent limits there. We talked a little bit about those. Style guides are the way that we have come across how do we encapsulate all of our thinking for any kind of content that goes into this one website. So we're trying to capture and sort of codify all of our thinking about design and presentation of that content and consumption of it across all these different designs in a way that is not only device agnostic, but content agnostic. And I think that's actually a particularly troubling phrase because there's only so far that you can go. And further, if you look at that site and start to explore some of the different design systems, I was only able to find on styleguides.io 2 or 3 that actually have something dealing with typographic scale across screen sizes. And that's critical because you can't have the same proportion of scale of a heading to body copy on large desktop and have the attention that it needs and not end up with really ungainly, awkward line breaks on a very small screen. You're really kind of losing out on some nuance there. The BBC excels, of course. They actually have a whole litany of different sizes and line heights of text based across different screen sizes. So they've really thought this through quite well. But it's still trying to be that one system for all content. And I really wanted to talk for a second about that. This notion of having something that's designed for all possible solutions. So going back to the 20s, in the US Army, which wasn't even the Air Force yet, it was the Army Air Corps, they measured a bunch of pilots to figure out how to build planes. So they needed to figure out, where do the seats go, how do the shoulder straps fit, where do we put the controls and the throttles. And so they just measured a whole bunch of pilots, they came up with some average measurements, and they built the planes. 20 years later, after World War II, they were growing tremendously, and the fatalities and training incidents were going through the roof, and they didn't know why. There were better planes, there were more people, better training, less stress. They weren't in an active wartime situation, yet they were still having this tremendous rate of fatalities in these training exercises. So they started to go back to the data. And this is a fantastic bit of UX research. They looked at that data, looked at those measurements, and they started measuring pilots again. And over several hundred pilots, they found that not one matched all 10 of those measurements. Not one. If they dropped it down to try and match 3, they got 5% of the pilots. So the seats were fixed, the straps were fixed, the controls were fixed, and nobody was actually fit for them. So in doing all that work, to design for the average, you end up optimizing for no one. And that is the problem that we have with design systems. And that is why we end up in a situation like this. And it's not that I don't like dogs, obviously I do, but we've ended up with this system that tries to present exactly the same thing for any piece of content across any system. So when you apply that across a publication, whether it's the Toast or if it's the New York Times, where they're publishing hundreds and thousands of pieces of content every year, you end up with all system and no soul. And I think that's a pretty sad place to be. It's not that the design system isn't helpful, it's that we're using it as an endpoint. It's not the pinnacle, it's the foundation. It's the plateau. We need that to support our work in bringing great design and consistency to the experience, but that's not the endpoint. That's where we start. That's where we have the ability to go further and design for the specific. We've created a new crystal goblet. And I don't want to stop here. I want to make sure that we realize where we are and that this is the start of a road, not the end of one. So 2 years ago, variable fonts were introduced. And there was something really fantastic about that that struck me just in the announcement of that, and then as I started to work with it. So let's talk a little bit about what they are. So normally when you're working with fonts, there are a whole bunch of different files that you need to call. And because of performance and slow networks and all of these different realities that we need to work with, that commuter rail into Boston, believe me, I know. I lose signal 3 times in a 1-hour train ride in the most developed area in the country. So even there we don't have infrastructure to really support high speed or any speed at any given time. So this idea of having all of these different font files that we're loading in order to get that modulation and pacing that we want in our design in order to better communicate, we don't do. So we only load a couple of them. Well, instead, we could just load one. And so that's the magic of a variable font, is it's one font that acts as many. It's got the entire design space that the type designer has enabled, width, weight, and various other axes, all contained in a single file. So bringing back Tristan and Tilly, because they really will help illustrate the kinds of things that we have going on in that single font file. But it's not just width, it's also weight. And, you know, I tried to be as appropriate as possible given the different size, but also you could be varying X height. Or, of course, slant. So all of these things can be contained. It's not about distorting the typeface, it's actually what the type designer intends. So when you have a typeface that actually supports all these different axes, you can do a lot of really interesting things to sort of modulate that experience. It doesn't have to be always on or always off. Jen Simmons has been talking a lot this year about how there's a real strong connection between film and the web that's really gone really unconsidered, especially with Flash kind of going away. But a web page really is a portal, similar to the frame in a camera. And we could use motion more. That animation in UI has been very effective, but we don't have to stop with just something pulsing or moving in. It actually could be slowly changing while you're actually experiencing that content to kind of highlight or draw attention to different aspects of that message that you're trying to get across. So by dumbing things down, we've traded that possible voice for page speed, and now we have an opportunity to reverse that. Kick that objection to the side because we can actually load this single smaller asset. And I'll get to some real numbers there in a little bit, but and then we can have the whole range of that possible design space. And we can also start to react to user context. So depending on where that content is being viewed, whether it's based on screen size or other device parameters like ambient light, we can actually react. And we can create a system that's a little bit more resilient and a little bit easier to work with. So on the left, we've been looking at a lot of Roslindale from David Jonathan Ross. Now we have Sero, which is one from Typemates, which is a German type foundry. And one of the things that I really loved about this one is it has a width axis. So when you're on a small screen and you have these very short, choppy lines, you can just adjust the width of the letters a little bit, get a longer line length that's very much in line with, it's still visible, it's still the right size, but it's slightly narrower. So it's a smoother experience for reading longer form content. It's also particularly helpful in multiple languages. So you can adjust based on the language that's specified in the HTML and make the characters wider or narrower. So CJK you might want to set a little bit bigger, and then German you might want to set a little bit narrower so you have less awkward line breaks. And then of course you can layer that with other CSS techniques. So we can do things to combine. If you notice, the descender of the Y is bumping into the T, and I really want that tightly set headline. And if I could only adjust that ascender and descender just a tiny little bit, it would look so much more polished. But I don't have to stop there. I can also, again, adjust the width, use CSS hyphenation, and get a much smoother line breaks on the right. And again, have this slightly more polished experience. And these are all things that work all the time. They're not specific to the content. So we can still have our design system cake and eat our better typography too. I'm torturing that metaphor a little bit. But I don't want to leave anybody in the dark. We can also include a night mode. And one of the cool things, if you have a grade axis, and look very carefully at the body copy there, because oftentimes it starts to break down when you reverse the contrast, but it's really good for low light. If you could increase the grade of that text just ever so slightly, it creates a more readable contrast between foreground and background. Was not supposed to advance right there. See if I can get that to actually do what it's supposed to do. Okay, so watch the body copy, and then it went away. Last time I'm going to do this. Low light sensing, low vision. Accessibility, usability in more conditions. Those can all be triggered either by user input or if anybody ever actually implements the ambient light API in the web. Firefox had it and they pulled it because nobody was actually doing anything with it. So we'll get it back, or if you're working in apps, you'll have it there too. And that's really kind of remarkable stuff. So we're combining typography, user experience, and accessibility all in that one win that we get by having a typeface that's this flexible. And so the importance of this diagram here is I want to reinforce this is not about distorting a typeface. This is about leveraging what the type designer intended. So you can see the main form of the letter, but also you see all these points that are indicating how wide and how narrow, how thick and how thin that letter form can be. And that's the beautiful thing about this format is it's just storing the deltas, the offsets of those points, and then it's letting the browser interpolate in between. So it's a very efficient file format. Instead of having hundreds of K of different files, you might have 100K or sometimes even less and have the entire design space at your disposal. So this is kind of what it looks like. And I wanted to show you what a little bit of the real CSS is. So it's a little bit different than defining an at-font face stanza. You have to note that it's a variable font, so it's WAF2 variations or TTF variations. And instead of just specifying font weight, normal, bold, or some number, you actually indicate the range. Same thing is true with font stretch, which is how you'd access the width axis. And then you also have font style that can either be italic, which is on or off, or oblique, where you can define a degree range, and that's the slant axis. So you generally wouldn't find both of those in a single typeface. It's more common in sans serif for there to be a slant where you can go anywhere in between. Italics usually has glyph substitution, so you have slightly different characters. So that's why you'll have one or the other. And this is how it might look in your CSS to leverage. And I forgot to update. Font stretch should be expressed in a percentage. And now, we all might like to have 100% be normal. It's actually up to the typeface designer. So one that I'm going to show you later actually goes from 0 to 1,000. I mean, you'll see why. It's actually way more broader a range than you might think. But generally speaking, that's kind of what we're angling for. You'll probably see things between 50 and 60% and maybe 150%. Most won't have much bigger range than that. And then you also have the lower level setting, font variation settings, that is where you can actually specify things all together. But the important thing there is you use this to access the custom axes, because there's more. There are 5 registered axes, the ones that I've been showing you about width, weight, slant, italics, and font optical sizing. I'll show you a little bit more about that. That one's a little bit more subtle, but it's pretty fantastic when it comes to adapting text for small or large physical representation. And the neat thing about the format is the type designer can define any other axis they want, give it a 4-letter tag, and then a number range, and you can access it in CSS now. Every shipping browser will support it. So as of a few weeks ago, Firefox shipped version 62. Yay. That was the last of them to support it. Safari, Chrome, Edge, Firefox, and the main browsers on Android and iOS all support variable fonts. And you have the ability to use feature detection in CSS so that you can actually implement it now and still have sort of regular web fonts or fallback fonts in CSS for browsers that don't support it. So here's an example showing the custom axes and what that might look like. So grade, G-R-A-D, that's the one to increase the text contrast. The bottom 2 are about ascenders and descenders. And that's where I was playing around with that in Amstelvar with the ascenders and descenders in the lowercase y and the t. So this is another page that I designed for Monotype. And this is running live in the browser. It's in an iframe, so I can play around with it a little bit and show you what might happen when that resizes. And this was done doing a single font. One font for the entire 1 to 900 weight range and italics of FF Meta, which is a really beautiful typeface. And while it's a little bit weird in the way it reflows that way, it does work quite nicely on your phone, everywhere else, and it is 84K for that one file to get all of that dynamic range in your typography, and it really can add a tremendous amount to your design. But that's not the only thing that has been kind of picking up steam, and if you have access to supporting variable fonts, that also means you have access to things like CSS variables and calculations. And so all these things started coming together for me, and that's the thing that I just showed you that I did for Monotype, which is on CodePen, by the way, so anybody can actually go play around with that. But this combination of using variable fonts and these custom properties, CSS variables and calculations, can allow for a really fluid typography across any screen size, and you can define what the high and the low points are. So what I'm doing here is defining some breakpoint values, and then setting a minimum and maximum size for my H1. And when we go into this next screen, I apologize for the middle. Ignore that for the moment. Mobile first, starting at the top, we're basically just using a calc to add an m value to the number that we had for the small end of the range. So that equates to 5m. And then down at the bottom, once we hit a minimum width of 75m, it's going to go with the max value. So 5 and 10 at the low end and the high end. And everything in the middle is going to just be math. And the wonderful thing about it is you generally don't ever have to touch that formula. All you do is reassign the variables at the low and the high end and the breakpoints if you want to see where those things might change. So it starts off looking at the max and the min that you've defined, does a little math there. It does a little math based on viewport width and the breakpoints at the low and the high end. And it actually will do a smooth calculation. As soon as you hit that low end breakpoint from 5m all the way up to 10 when you hit to 75, you'll never have to write another media query. And your whole typographic system will scale uniformly. And so you can do this with your headings separately from line height, and you can also impact some of the other values. Currently, there's no way to introduce this kind of formula and end up with a unitless value, so you can't use it to directly impact your variable font axes, but that's coming. They've actually updated the syntax. It's in, I think, an editor's draft right now. I don't know if it's been implemented by any browsers, but there will be a way for us to use calc and CSS to get a bare number value. So you could actually have a weight change that calculates, or optical sizing. So all of those things allow you to tailor the text to the size that it's being presented in a much more fluid and accurate way. And you end up writing a lot less code to boot. And if you want to take this H1 and drop it into a sidebar for whatever reason, or if it's part of that teaser that Ethan was writing earlier, then inside that teaser component, you might just reassign a couple of variables for the low and the high end, and everything else will still just work. So it's really pretty remarkable, and the custom properties are really incredibly powerful when you use them in that way. So I don't want to make you think that it's only about typesetting, because there actually are a lot of really beautiful things you can do with variable font. So the guys at Underwear, that's why the screen's dark, by the way, they sent me something that they've been working on where it actually has an axis of time. And I thought that was really kind of incredible, because it allows you to do things like this. But it's not just drawing in the lettering, there's ink gain. But it's also about stroke order, because they could do this to represent a Chinese character where it's critical that you draw the strokes in the correct order in order to convey the accurate meaning. And they can actually define that inside the font itself. So the font also serves as a writing tool, which is really kind of fantastic. So that kind of thing just got me thinking more and more about how we might be able to use type as a design element. It sacrifices nothing from accessibility because the text is already there. It's simply the visual representation of it that draws us in and brings us along for that journey. That's not the only people using it. Adidas has been actually working on variable fonts for over a year, and they're using them in all of their print communication. The only company I know of that's doing this. They're not even using it on the web yet. So this is Adenoia. This is their actual typeface in a responsive variable form with a width and weight axis that goes from 0 to 1,000. And so just to give you an idea of the sort of flexibility that you get with something like that, it's really pretty remarkable. So when you start looking at their advertising now, keep that in mind, that they're actually doing this with one file. They hired Kenneth Ormandy to work with, Jeremy Mickle is the type designer. Leon Amos is their head of brand at Adidas. And they hired Kenneth Ormandy to build a plugin for them in InDesign that will actually allow them to do things like this. Highlight a bunch of text and say fit to width, and it will just work. And they also have Chop, which I think when you look at that, you know that it says sport. So this is something that, imagine what they do with uniforms. All the custom uniforms that they make, that all the schools order throughout the world, there's thousands of them. And what they're able to do with this is actually elevate the level of design that every single school gets, because they can customize the width of the lettering used in the names so everybody's jersey can be read It's not skewed. Anybody can work with it. It's something they can build into a system. It's something that could actually be worked with in JavaScript, so that you can actually bring this more thoughtful, integrated typographic DNA that is perpetrating the entire Adidas brand and bring it into every single piece of clothing, every single billboard, and soon every single aspect of their website. So I was really excited to be able to show this. You're actually some of the first people that are getting to see the variable font in use in a web page. They're not really doing that yet. So I was really grateful that they actually allowed me to do that. So we just have to remember that words have power, and typography is what gives it its voice. Thank you very much.